Okay, so I want to jump into the Flash War Prelude, Flash Annual #1. For those of you guys who don't know, when it comes to comic books, annuals kind of take different forms. We've talked about this before. It used to be that annuals were just kind of there. It was just kind of like a filler story. And it was usually isolated from everything else that was going on. You would have like a main story arc, and then it would get around to where we have 5 weeks in a month instead of 4 weeks in a month, or something weird along those lines. Basically like 5 Wednesdays, rather, as opposed to 4. And they just kind of need like a filler story. And so what they do is they just throw in a random, annual, and usually it's for like up and coming writers and artists, the ability for those guys to kind of make their bones, show off what they're capable of and that kind of a thing. But that's really about it. What this does is it actually kind of breaks that trend, which is something that's been going on for really a couple decades, if we're gonna be honest with ourselves. Annuals have really sort of evolved from like that old hat format to basically being like, tied into a lot of the ongoing stories. And this one really fleshes out, or at least brings us the prelude to Flash War. Of course, Flash War basically being an event that's gonna see all the Flashes, quote unquote, going to war with each other. But this initially picks up in the 25th century after the events of Running Scared. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, Running Scared was a story that we did where we basically dealt with the idea of the retold origin of Eobard Thawne, of the Reverse Flash, in the sense that instead of him just kind of being a guy who idolized the Flash and then went back into the past and realized he was destined to become Reverse Flash and it kind of drove him insane, instead it was the idea that he and Barry shared a very personal moment when Barry traveled to the 25th century and met Eobard Thawne for the first time. And where Barry trained Eobard to use his powers and so on and so forth, when Eobard went back to the modern day, he saw Barry sharing that same moment, or I guess went back to the past rather, he saw Barry sharing that same moment with Wally West, and the result was that he felt betrayed and became a villain. But the fact remains here that in the aftermath of that story Running Scared, which basically saw Iris West just kind of like dispersing the atoms of, Eobard Thawne all over the place using some kind of a ray gun, what this did is it set in motion the idea that people wanted to know what was going on. And what we ended up having was this group that was basically kind of tasked with tracking down Barry, basically traveling to the past, tracking down Barry, and then quote unquote arresting him. And this group was essentially tasked by like a masked man. We didn't really know who he was. But following this, we actually kind of, jump back to the modern age right now and basically pick up with a guy called the Top. Now, the Top was never a huge character in the realm of DC Comics. He was one of the small time guys. The overall gist is that he could basically create like these massive bursts of wind and spin things and so on and so forth, much like a Top, like you would expect with that whole ideology. He was a John Broome, Carmine Infantino creation, I think. But the whole idea behind this is that he's just kind of there wreaking havoc, and then that's really about it. And the result is that we end up having, Barry and Wally West, and then the young New 52 Wally West, they all just kind of team up and they basically defeat Top, and then that's really about it. But from here, this is when things really start to focus on Wally, because that's kind of the nature of this. Remember, when it comes to the classic Wally West, the red-haired Wally West, for the most part, despite the fact that he's back in DC Rebirth, there hasn't really been a whole lot of time spared to really deal with like how he's coping with the situation. We've seen small little bits here and there. We really saw it a lot in like the DC Universe Rebirth one-shot and like the Flash Aftermath story. But for the most part, a lot of the stories that have been told by DC regarding, classic Wally West have been told in a way that just kind of acclimates him to going back to the Titans, getting in contact again with Barry Allen, that kind of a thing, kind of going back to being a superhero. And it's cool because it's actually just sort of a slow build. It's a slow burn. And that's the best way to tell stories in my book. The best way to tell it is to kind of let it grow organically. And when they sit down at a taco stand, Wally kind of like harkens back to, when he was younger and he used to come here with Iris West all the time. And so it's kind of cool because it hits back at these small moments with his character. What we also end up finding out here is that what Barry Allen had done is that with the whole scenario with the Top, where that battle had basically finished and then Iris West had seemingly come running out of nowhere in order to basically interview classic Wally West, we end up finding out Barry engineered that. He didn't engineer the actions of the Top. He basically tipped off Iris West to what was going on so that she would show up and she would confront Wally. And the reason why is, remember, Wally's out of time here to a degree, or at least it kind of seems that way. Remember, when it comes to DC Rebirth, the kind of standard chronology in terms of how most people accept it is that you had the classic DC timeline, and then you had the events of Flashpoint, and things were supposed to go back to normal after the events of Flashpoint, but Dr. Manhattan stepped in. And what it meant was that Wally West was kind of forgotten. He was sort of locked in the Speed Force. And it was a way for DC to explain why he wasn't there. And so with classic Wally coming back, for the most part, everything's different from from the way he remembers. Linda Park doesn't remember him. Iris West doesn't remember him. For the most part, they don't really know each other. And these are pretty big moments because remember, Linda Park was the girlfriend of Wally West and then eventually his wife, and they had kids together. So when Wally thinks about Linda Park, the Linda Park that he remembers a family. He remembers them basically making a life for themselves, settling down, that kind of a thing. But when he's thrust into this current landscape for DC Comics, none of this stuff is going on. And so it's him trying to deal with things. Now, where he should actually go through and talk to Iris and reveal his identity identity and tell her everything he knows, where he should go find Linda Park, and even if nothing happens, basically say, hey, look, these are the things that I remember, although that would be kind of creepy. But the bigger picture here and the bigger gist of this is that Wally kind of takes it as an affront. Now, he takes it offensively for a couple of reasons. Wally's coming from the standpoint of, well, Iris wouldn't be able to handle this. Like, if I told Iris everything that's going on, she wouldn't be able to grasp it. And the whole idea of Barry is, but dude, like, she destroyed Eobard Thawne. I promise she can handle herself. Like, she can handle this whole situation. But for Wally, it's not that simple. And even then, it's one of those things where, okay, even if she could, of what business is it of yours? And that brings in the direct, juxtaposition of like Wally versus Barry, the philosophical differences between the two. But it is kind of intriguing because in this whole conversation that they have, this whole argument that they have, they kind of race a little bit and then they stop, and Barry's like, hey, look, man, don't make me chase you. And Wally simply says, look, if I wanted to run away from you, there's no way you could stop me. And that's true. One thing to keep in mind, this is one of the reasons why a lot of classic fans of The Flash love classic Wally West, is because when it comes down to like the hierarchy of the fastest speedsters, Wally West is the fastest Flash. He's faster than Barry Allen. That's the way this whole thing with the Flash mythos works, is for a time, all you had were like these disconnected speedsters. You had like Johnny Chambers and Jesse Chambers that discovered a formula. They gave him super speed, and when they said the formula, they gained their powers. You had Jay Garrick, who was exposed to heavy water, whatever it is, and he inhaled those gases, and suddenly he can run at the speed of sound. And then you had Max Mercury, and you had all these different characters who were able to tap into the Speed Force. It wasn't, or I guess really gain superpowers. It wasn't until Terminal Velocity by Mark Waid that they were all unified, that it was all, hey, this formula that Johnny and Jesse Chambers say, the heavy water, whatever it was that Jay Garrick inhaled, what it did is it all allowed them by one measure over another to tap into the Speed Force. And so that's how they all gain their powers. But where Wally West is the fastest because he directly mainlines the Speed Force, meaning he draws directly off of it, Barry Allen was the one who made it. And so that's how all these different characters sort of fit in. So it's a pretty cool moment when it comes down to these characters, because it's just kind of like, hey, look, I don't necessarily need you anymore. Because remember, when it comes to classic Wally West, when he first became the Flash, Crisis on Infinite Earths happens, the story ends, Wally West ages up, Barry Allen's dead, and then he's, kind of stuck under Barry's shadow for a little while. And then under the writing of like Mark Waid and all those guys, it was basically kind of taking him out of that shadow and making him his own superhero. And so because of that, Wally just kind of grew into his own character. It's really kind of interesting with regards to this whole argument between these two guys. But the fact remains, when Wally sits down and kind of thinks about the various people that might remember him or don't really remember him per se, the whole question is, who is it that would remember him? Of all the people who were out there, who would recall his existence? And he thinks back to a girl by the name of Frances Kane that he grew up with. Now, Frances Kane was introduced back in 1982 by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, and she was a Teen Titans character. The way this whole thing worked out is much like Chris Claremont with the X-Men, where he was just like creating all different kinds of mutants and then just throwing them into the stories and seeing how people responded. Wolfman and Perez, during their kind of iconic run on the Teen Titans, had done very much the exact same thing. The idea was just make it, throw it in the story, send it out. If fans love it, keep it. If they don't, get rid of it. And so what you ended up having with Frances Kane is she was basically a girl who, grew up with Wally. She was his Lana Lang, so to speak. For those of you guys who don't know, Lana Lang is basically the girl that like first realized that Clark Kent had powers, taught him how to use his powers, and really kind of set the stage for Clark to become Superman later on, in addition to Jonathan and Martha Kent. But the whole idea was that she was alongside the Teen Titans for a little while. She kind of, worked with the team, but ultimately ended up just kind of walking away. And there was a lot of romance between herself and Wally West. And in fact, ultimately they just kind of ended up breaking up and going their own separate ways. But there was a point whereby I believe she was trying to find a way to get rid of her powers, or at least like hone her powers of magnetism or something like that. But she ended up encountering a scientist who kind of like twisted her mind, and then she basically developed a split personality. But that's basically what happens here. Wally shows up and then just kind of starts talking to her and says, hey, look, I don't know if you know me, I don't know if you're familiar with me, but here's who I am, and I remember you when you were younger, and that kind of a thing. And then suddenly she starts to remember who he is. Now this works. That goes all the way back to DC Universe Rebirth #1. That's how he came back, was going to Barry Allen, visiting as many people as he could, anybody that knew him when he was a superhero, and then finally comes across Barry and says, you have to remember me. And at the last minute, Barry remembers him and Wally West is back. So that's kind of the shtick of his character at the moment, is he kind of travels around to people who have seemingly forgotten him and kind of quote unquote wakes up their memories. And so it is cool because basically she recalls everything about them. The fact that they were friends, the fact that they dated for a while, there was a romance, and then immediately the magenta personality kicks in and she loses it. she just starts attacking him with everything she can get a hold of. But it is funny, and it is really intriguing because it's him kind of having to come back and cope with his own demons, you know, cope with the mistakes that he made in the past, the kind of things that he was involved in, all that kind of good stuff. For the most part, while he wants to spill the beans, in truth, with her being a villain, she's really the only one he can really confide in at the moment, or at least feels like he can confide in. Wally West is really just a prisoner of his own mind. He's just kind of locked in this cycle for himself. You know, it's not that he went to Iris and she rebuked him, it's that he's afraid to because maybe she won't remember him. And that's kind of the fearful thing about this, is that if you're Wally West and you say, okay, so like Barry Allen remembers me and like the Titans remember me, but like Iris West may not remember me, that'd be the most crushing thing because that's his aunt. That's like one of the closest people that he has. And to suddenly find out that she doesn't remember anything about him, she doesn't recall him at all, it would be devastating. And so it's almost one of those things where it's easier to just not ask than to basically get the worst kind of answer. And so what ends up happening here is where the magenta personality begins to settle down and Wally's able to kind of talk some sense back into Frances Kane, sort of bring that persona back out. This brings her character back. And so it really kind of teases the possibility that things could go one of two ways. If Wally has to choose between Linda Park and Frances Kane, which one will he choose? Now, depending on where you stand with the Flash comics, you could go either way. There are people who are classic fans that are like, nope, I want to see him marry Linda Park, and I want to see them have Jai and Iris West, and I want to see them like as younger kids, you know, and I want to see them be like a Flash family again. You know, classic Wally West fans would love to see that come back. But then some people are kind of like, yeah, but I mean, like, we've done that dance before. And so that's what people are kind of curious about. They're like, well, if we got Frances Kane, that changes everything because now Wally West has to deal with a girlfriend who's crazy as hell, but like, it's also a chick he dated at one point along the line. And so what you end up having is Wally sort of coming to grips with things. You know, is Wally basically saying, look, to this point in my life, I have been in this situation where I am in this, you know, this rebirth landscape. It's not the place that I remember, and I've effectively kind of kept myself shunted off. I've used the events of like fighting alongside the Titans, I've used the events of fighting alongside the Flash to effectively shy away from that part of my life and avoid it all. And so what he needs to do, or at least, you know, from his perspective, is to basically sit down and say, I have to come to grips with where I am right now. I have to come to grips with like where my life is at the moment. The longer he goes without talking to Linda Park, the least likely the opportunity is that they'll ever get together. Because if we're talking about, you know, something legitimate, she'll just find a guy and eventually settle down. But if Wally West steps in and says, hey, look, you know, let's get a cup of coffee. I really need to talk to you about something. And I know it's going to sound crazy as hell, but hear me out. If it sparks memories and she remembers who he is, suddenly everything comes rolling back in again. That's the risk. It's kind of like this in comic book adaptation of the nature of love. Sure, ask a girl out, get your heart broken, and that happens 1,000 times. But then you ask a girl out, she says yes, and you're married 4 years later. So, you know, it's one of those things where it's just kind of like, you never know how it's going to work out. You just got to give it a shot. You got to throw it out there and just kind of see what happens. And so where he ultimately kind of, you know, goes back to his position and really kind of says, look, I got to go back with the Flash family. You know, I'm as much a part of this as Barry Allen as anybody else. We end up jumping back to the 25th century. And as we go through this, we end up finding out that again, this guy is basically going through and tasking a group called the Renegades, which is kind of like the 25th century version of like the Rogues. You've got guys like Mirror Monarch and Commander Cold, but where that group is tasked with going back and essentially capturing Barry Allen, what we end up finding out is this group has actually been sent back by Hunter Zolomon. And this is cool. This is really interesting because as far as I'm aware, we have not seen Hunter Zolomon yet in DC Rebirth. And this begs the question, are we going to go with like his old school origin, where he's basically almost identical to Barry Allen in the sense that his parents, you know, never really, well, his parents never got along. Barry Allen's parents got along fine. Okay, so not exactly like Barry, but Hunter's parents didn't really get along too well. It turned out his father was a serial killer. His mom was going to turn him in. The father of Hunter killed his mom, and then he was arrested, or I guess he was really killed by the cops when everything popped off and he refused to surrender. And then basically had his legs broken, and then, you know, I guess, you know, was paralyzed, and then broke into like the Flash Museum and tried to use a cosmic treadmill, and then like it displaced him from the timeline. We might just do like a Hunter Zolomon explained video or something along those lines in anticipation for Flash War. I don't know. Okay, so we are, man, Flash War, dude, okay, Joshua Williamson. All right, I already owe Sean Murphy lunch, and I don't see any reason why we can't bring in Joshua Williamson. Dude, Joshua Williamson, man, if you ever stop writing the Flash, I'm gonna be so pissed. His work on Flash is nuts, and this story is no different. And here's the funny thing, it's like the culmination of everything we've been waiting for since like the beginning of DC Rebirth and the return of classic Wally West. It's like the one thing we've always wanted to see, and there's so many great moments in this. Okay, so initially this whole thing picks up up with like Flash and Barry going to war, right? Like they're just kind of like against each other, and it's like, well, if you're not gonna help me, then, you know, whatever, like Wally West just kind of freaking out on him. But we're not really given any context as to why. What we end up doing is kind of jumping back a little bit about, well, really about almost an hour earlier, and just kind of picking up with this whole thing. And this is kind of cool because this is an exchange between Iris West and the new 52 Wally West. But the difference here is that when it comes to like this exchange, it's different from the other ones that we've seen, because now Iris is totally aware of Wally, right? Like that was the whole thing. When classic Wally West first came back, red-haired Wally West, when he first reappeared, we knew from just like the history of DC that like he and Iris have like a long-standing history because they're family. But when he first appeared, he didn't want to like instigate a whole situation with Iris and like reveal to her his identity and so on and so forth. And that was just really like Williamson's way of working into DC Rebirth, in the sense that Rebirth is designed to bring back all the old stuff and work it into all the new stuff and kind of combine these two elements together. It created this idea that like classic Wally West was back, but we didn't know how far out his role would be. And over the course of the Flash run, and really as far as like the events in Titans and so on and so forth, we got these little tidbits where like little bits of classic Wally West past would kind of pop back up again. And so it's kind of cool because this scenario is basically like they're both aware of the idea of like who classic Wally West is and what's going on with this guy and so on and so forth. And it's interesting because then you have like Barry and Wally, who basically show up having dealt with, you know, a major issue and have just kind of like raced to this location. And it's one of the funny things because I still say that Wally West is faster than Barry, but like it's a funny situation, right? Like, because the way they're drawn here, it's awesome. It's like Ryu versus Ken. Like who's better in Street Fighter, Ryu or Ken? I say Ken because it was like in the old school Street Fighter games, he was faster. I don't know if he's still faster now. I haven't played Street Fighter in like 10 years, but still like it's interesting to me because what this does is it starts to throw in this idea that Wally West is getting a little more extreme in terms of the lengths that he will go to try to like bring his past back. And that works. It's not like it's a sudden shift that came on, you know, with like this story. It's been building up to this. You know, the idea was that when Wally first came back, he was largely hands off, but then he basically like he met back up with the Titans and they all remembered who he was. And so from there it was, well, I wonder who else will remember who I am. And so it really became more of like an obsession. And we get these small things here and there. For example, like in this instance, he remembers who Eobard Thawne is. And that's really kind of a throwback to the return of Barry Allen's story by Mark Waid. You know, back in really post 1984, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Flash stories were taken up by a handful of people. You had like Mike Baron, and really like Baron's run was designed to kind of throw Wally in this situation where he was always under the shadow of Barry. And it was like, well, Barry died in Crisis on Infinite Earths, and now, you know, I've got to be the new Flash, and man, it's just so hard because I'm trying to live up to the legacy of Barry. But then when Mark Waid took over, Waid's stance was, okay, let's get this show on the road. Because like people are tired of seeing Wally under the shadow of Barry. Let's actually like make Wally something cool. And that's why Mark Waid's Flash run is considered to be like the run of the Flash. It solidified Wally. But in one of the earlier stories, I would say the first major, like the first big story that Mark Waid wrote was the return of Barry Allen. And it was basically like the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths origin of Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash. And that's cool because that's what this is. You're no Barry Allen. Like it's literally this whole situation playing out. You have like Wally West, who is part of the Justice League. You have like a lot of these really cool moments. And that's the interesting thing behind this is like, you can tell that Joshua Williamson is a fan because these are throwbacks to things that fans will remember. This is like a love letter to all the fans of like classic Wally West. Now, at this point, we pick up with the arrival of the Renegades. Now, we talked about this in like the previous prelude video that we did to the events of Flash War, which is basically that like in the 25th century, the Rogues aren't really the Rogues. Like the Rogues don't really exist anymore. What you have is the Renegades, who are basically like good guys. They're more of like a police force of metahumans. But when you're, you know, classic Wally West, and when you're Barry Allen, and you've never met the Renegades, or at least as far as you're aware, you've never met the Renegades, you don't see them as renegades. You just see them as like souped up rogues, and that have just kind of like changed their name, but they still look the same. And that's exactly how they react. And so it's kind of cool because where Wally West is somewhat hot-headed, Barry kind of steps in and says, no, we need to kind of think things through. Now, this is where I would say Williamson seems to be hitting more towards the post-crisis, version of the Flash, as opposed to Wally West when we're talking about, 2004, 2005, 2006. And the reason why I say that is when Wally first became the Flash under like Mike Baron, when he basically stepped away from Kid Flash and replaced Barry, he was a hot-headed in a lot lot of ways. But over the writing of Mark Waid and like through the life experiences that Wally had, he became a lot more processed. He became a lot more wise. This really came as like a byproduct of not only Linda Park and Wally's own kids, but things like Impulse, Bart Allen being sent from the future into the past so Wally could train him on how to use his powers. It came from wisdom that was imparted by people like Max Mercury and Jay Garrick. So because of the fact that Wally was surrounded by so many, experienced speedsters, he really began to grow into his own and become a lot more experienced in terms of what it meant to be a Flash, and that you can't just run into every situation without really thinking about what's going on. And so that's where I would say this kind of seems to be a bit of a alteration from the Wally that we're used to, but it's not a bad thing, because this kind of feeds into the idea that like Wally isn't really even sure what's going on in his own life. Like he's gaining memories all the time. And so where he remembers Linda Park, maybe he gains a memory later on where Linda Park died. And again, it's kind of crazy because he's basically remembering all the things as they happened before 2011. So for the most part, we kind of know how this is going to turn out with regards to people who have been reading The Flash for quite some time, or at least we have a general idea. But that's the beauty of Rebirth, is just because we believe we know how it's going to turn out doesn't mean it will turn out that way. Now, of course, Wally's response, being a little more hot-headed, is no. He takes Iris and he races off. Now, this is cool because with this situation, you could look at this and say, well, Iris is like the one real thing, the one real tangible thing that Wally West remembers that he can reach out and touch now. Because remember, he still keeps that barrier, that separation between himself and Linda, because the current day Linda doesn't know who Wally is. Now, it doesn't mean that she won't. I mean, it took Iris kind of waking up to realize who Barry was, or I'm sorry, who Wally was. And there's nothing to say that the same thing won't happen with Linda. But we talked about this in the previous videos. The fear that Wally has with Linda Park is that maybe he'll wake her up and she'll freak out and leave, and like she'll abandon him. She won't embrace him with open arms like, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot about you. She'll just be like, okay, this is too much for me to handle, and she'll leave him. And so it'll be like losing her all over again. That's really like the biggest fear that he deals with. The other half of this, and this is one of the things that I love about Iris in the comics, is she's like, get your hands off of me. It's so cool. This is why I like Iris in the TV show and Iris in the comics, because they're very similar in terms of how they work. And so for the most part, when it comes to the Renegades basically chasing down, like Wally and Iris and trying to get a hold of Barry and like the new 52 Wally West and so on and so forth, they start kicking their powers in play. And that's when you learn that Golden Glider is not like the Golden Glider that we know. This version is a yellow lantern, and that's awesome. That's super cool. The other half of this though is that it does kind of shift up the nature of the Yellow Lanterns, and it does work because we've seen that in Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, right? Like just because someone is wielding a ring of Sinestro does not mean they have to be a villain. This is not uncharted waters. The other problem with this though, when it comes to Wally, is that while this is going on, he keeps getting these memory feeds that are fed in, just these memories that keep coming back and coming back and coming back. And that's something that I want you to notice here. They're coming at faster intervals. Now, it may just be the manner in which Williamson's been telling these stories and the way the stories are being told in like Titans, but the general gist was that classic Wally West came back in DC Universe Rebirth #1, and then he would get a jolt of a memory, and then it would be like 1 or 2 story arcs, and then he would get another one, and then it'd be another 1 or 2 story arcs, and then he would get another one. Now it's he gets one, and then bam, a couple minutes later he gets one, and then a couple minutes later he gets one. They're coming back faster and faster, and what this means is that all these memories of Wally are just pouring into his mind. And so from there, what happens is basically Commander Cold stops everything. He's like, look, something's going on here, but our orders are to get Iris West, bring her to the future, put her on trial for taking out Eobard Thawne. And so because of this, like Commander Cold is no pun intended, he's kind of cold here, in the sense that he's like, hey, look, we'll help Wally, but like you need to come with us. You don't come with us, Wally doesn't get any help. So, make your decision. And it's kind of crazy here because ultimately, like they end up just kind of going along. All the speedsters end up going with them because they don't really trust the Renegades. They don't know anything about them. It's this group that looks like the Rogues that appears from a temporal portal and says, you got to come with us. You have to believe us. We're good guys. There's no reason to believe them. And so classic Wally, Barry, New 52 Wally West, they all basically travel with Iris and the Renegades to jump into the 25th century. The problem with this is that when they get there, everybody arrives except for classic Wally. And what we end up finding out is somebody screwed with the temporal device of Captain Cold so that Wally would be lost in transit. And so what we end up doing is transitioning over to Wally himself in what really looks kind of like a broken remnant of the Flash Museum. And as he goes through there, he basically starts getting these words from this guy. And he says, like, this is your life. This is the museum of your life. This is everything you've lost. And this is when we start getting like these amazing Easter eggs, like showing Wally West when he was Kid Flash, showing his first encounter with Impulse, showing Max Mercury. But once he goes through here, like this person says, like, this is your entire life. This is everything you know. Jai and Iris West, the children of Wally, are here. They're shown in kind of like a video feed of sorts. And so when the question is like, who are you? What is going on here? What we end up getting is the return of Hunter Zolomon. And Hunter Zolomon is amazing. Okay, so Eobard Thawne, on the original Reverse Flash, he goes all the way back to the 1970s, right? Like he's pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths. Once Crisis on Infinite Earths happened in 1985, 1986, then we got like a new version of Eobard Thawne. And then following that version of Eobard Thawne, Jeff Johns took over the Flash story and he gave us another Reverse Flash named Hunter Zolomon. Now the difference between Eobard Thawne and Hunter Zolomon is that where Eobard Thawne was originally just like a massive fan of the Flash and then was obsessed with Barry, made himself look like Barry, and then traveled back into the past only to find out Barry had died, and then looked through the Flash Museum and realized he was destined to become his mortal enemy and went insane. Hunter Zolomon was totally different. Hunter Zolomon was basically a guy who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had a really, really crappy upbringing. He was involved in a conflict, lost the use of his legs, but he was a huge, I would say he worked alongside the Flash more so than anything else, worked alongside Barry as like a criminal profiler. The way he ended up becoming a villain was because once he basically lost everything that mattered to him, he basically went to the Flash and said like, help me run back in time. Use your cosmic treadmill, help me run back in time and fix everything that went wrong. And like the Flash said no. And so because of that, Hunter Zolomon's heart was just filled with anger and wrath at the fact that the Flash just wanted to hog all his power to himself. And so he basically found a way to copy the powers of the Flash, and he's been a villain ever since. But there's like history there. And that's why Hunter Zolomon says we were friends once, because they were. They were very good friends once. They worked alongside each other. The relationship between Hunter Zolomon and Wally West is like the rebirth equivalent of August Hart and Barry Allen, in the sense that August Hart became Godspeed because of the fact that he was driven by a desire to kind of fix everything. Hunter Zolomon's motivations were a little bit different, but the pre-villainous nature, the pre-villainous relationship between himself and Wally was almost completely identical. Now, Hunter's idea is you have to destroy the Speed Force. Now, we don't know what effect that'll have. We don't know if destroying the Speed Force will lead to like the deaths of Jay Garrick and Max Mercury and Johnny and Jesse Chambers and like Giant Iris West and like, Impulse, like all these characters. We don't know if that's going to be the case. Instead, all we know is that like the Speed Force would be destroyed. But that's the question. What lengths is Wally willing to go to not only bring back all the speedsters who were there, or at least presumably do that, but also basically go back and like return things to the way that they're supposed to be. But it's kind of cool here because remember, Barry Allen tried this during the events of Flashpoint, and that's what screwed everything up. Okay, so we are picking up with Flash War Part 2. Okay, Flash War Part 2 is amazing. Dude, okay, dude, Flash is so amazing. I really wish Joshua Williamson had been in Denver Comic Con because I got to see everybody else. I got to see Sam Humphries and hang out with him. Dude, man, I love Sam Humphries writing. He's like one of my top 5 favorite writers. Like, I'll read anything the guy writes. But anyway, okay. So Flash War is basically kind of like wrapping up the whole thing with Wally West, right? Like we talked about that in the first video, that in DC Universe Rebirth #1, Barry Allen had essentially pulled Wally West out of the Speed Force, and then Wally's just kind of been free floating ever since. Like he's been in a couple Flash stories, he's been part of the main Titans roster, but that's really it. Like the whole idea of like what's going on with him behind the scenes and how it ties into all the different aspects of the Flash mythos that have basically been missing throughout all this time, none of those questions were really answered. And Flash War gives us this. Specifically, this story opens up with Jai and Ira. I always thought it was Iris West, and I feel like it was Iris West at one point, and then it was changed. And I want to say somebody mentioned that at Denver Comic Con, that it was Iris West before Jeff Johns wrote Infinite Crisis, and then it was Ira afterwards. Although I'm not going to swear to that. The cool thing about this is, remember, when it came to Jai, or when it came to the kids of Wally West, a lot of the lessons he imparted on them were part and parcel to what happened with Impulse, with Bart Allen. And the reason why was because after Barry Allen died in Crisis on Infinite Earths, or at least was believed to have been dead, Wally West became the new Flash. And the idea of DC at the time was, well, let's just give him a new Kid Flash. Like, it makes the most sense. So they grabbed Bart Allen from the future. They said that his Speed Force powers were running out of control. He didn't really know how to contain them. And so they brought him to the 20th century. They handed him over to Wally to teach him how to control his powers. Wally didn't know how. He was like, I mean, I guess I can, but I'm not really a teacher. I can impart what pearls of wisdom I gained from Barry, but I'm not really a teacher in this regard. I'm not that familiar with the Speed Force. And now those things changed with stories like Terminal Velocity, but what ended up happening was Bart Allen was handed over to Max Mercury, who trained him. But the idea of Wally helping to kind of get Impulse's powers in check, which is to say, putting him in a position to where his Speed Force abilities are stabilized and they're not accelerating his aging, is basically what was imparted to the kids of Wally. It was sitting down and saying they had the exact same problem. That's kind of where this comes from. The issue with this is that Wally didn't remember him. When Wally came back, he did not remember his kids. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is that it was a little piecemeal. Now, in reality, I'd say this is Joshua Williamson kind of going through and doing it in stages, right? Like if Wally had come back in DC Universe Rebirth #1, and then it turned into where are Wally West's kids? And then it turned into like the whole thing with Linda Park. Then like basically the whole concept of Wally would have been fleshed out in 6 months. And there would have been no real storytelling storytelling to give after that. Instead, what DC's doing here is they're staging it out. They're saying, here's Wally when he comes back, and then here's a couple things here and there. And then here's Wally with some part of his past, and then here's a couple things here and there. And then here's Flash War. We basically get the whole kit and caboodle. And so it's cool for what it is, because what we end up knowing here, or at least what we're kind of told here, is that a lot of this centers around Hunter Zolomon. Now remember, in the last video we talked about this, that Hunter Zolomon was Jeff Johns' Reverse Flash. The thing here is that what you end up having is you end up having Wally who kind of freaks out and attacks Hunter Zolomon. And when he does, he starts to get these kind of flashback of memories, in the sense that he almost kind of absorbs memories directly from Hunter Zolomon himself. Now, this is part and parcel to the powers of Wally West. So back when Wally really became the Flash, replaced Barry, the idea was to make him different. The idea of Wally is to say, okay, let's make him interesting and unique. And so Wally has powers and has abilities that are tied to him that no one else has. For example, Wally West cannot be cut off from the Speed Force. This is the reason why when DC Rebirth happened, Wally West was absorbed into the Speed Force as opposed to just kind of losing his powers and just sort of being a regular person out there somewhere. Wally mainlines it. And so because of that fact, like, he's wildly powerful. Not only that, when it comes to like time travel, Barry Allen has to use a cosmic treadmill. He can bounce through dimensions. He can, like, you know, vibrate himself from one dimension to the next, but he can't run back and forward through time of his own volition. He has to use the cosmic treadmill to do it. Wally does not have that limitation. He can run back and forth through time. We'll see how that kind of plays out here. But one of the other big things that Wally has, and this is, I believe, a power that was actually given to people after Wally, is he has the ability to kind of transfer Speed Force powers to people that give them like healing factors, different things like that. But when he basically goes to attack Hunter Zolomon, because of this ability that he has, he picks up on the realization that Hunter doesn't have his powers anymore. And this is kind of the cool thing, is because the way Williamson writes this, it's a bit of a mystery here. We kind of know that Hunter Zolomon's working with Eobard Thawne, but we don't know how far this goes. And where Hunter Zolomon is talking to Wally, what he's doing is saying things like, my powers are gone. I don't have my abilities anymore. Because of the fact that my powers are gone, it's given me time to kind of reflect on my life, to reflect on the decisions that I've made and the things that I've done. And ultimately, I've essentially seen the light. Hunter Zolomon was originally a good guy. He fell to becoming a villain because he was obsessed with the idea of fixing his own past. His desire to become a villain was rooted in his own struggles and strife, you know, things that people go through. He just took a different road. But redemption was always right around the corner for Hunter. And Wally doesn't really know how to take that. But at the same time, Wally's also a good guy. And he's like, I mean, we kind of have to give him the benefit of the doubt. But more so than any of that, Hunter Zolomon knows the location, or claims to know the location, of where Wally's kids are and how to get them. And so the overriding factor here for Wally is he wants his kids back. And so it's kind of a throwback for the old school Wally fans. All kinds of things go into this whole ideology. And so from here, you really kind of sidetrack for a second with Barry and with the Renegades. Now, of course, the Renegades are kind of like this temporal police force that had been created by Hunter Zolomon himself, but there was kind of a bigger ruse that was going on. We didn't really know what it was. All we knew was that the idea was Iris West was being taken for the quote unquote murder of Eobard Thawne, and that was it. What you ended up picking up here with is this idea that Barry's kind of like, look, I need to find Wally West. Now, this is kind of one of those interesting situations where you kind of see like Barry and Wally juxtaposed next to each other, and then you kind of get, you know, really kind of, you know, come to this understanding that the story is what makes the characters interesting, right? Like Barry Allen in and of himself is not really interesting to me. He's just a guy who runs really fast. Flash War to me is interesting because it's about Wally getting his kids back. That's it. It's Wally going to every length he needs to get his kids back, but it's Wally retreading the water of what Barry Allen did. Barry Allen's just kind of like running, trying to find Wally at the moment. Like, where in the world is Wally West? And, you know, you guys of the Renegades have been set up. This is all just one great big huge ruse. You guys have been tricked. You don't know it, but you guys have been tricked. You know, Barry basically grabs, Commander Cold. They whisk over to where Hunter Zolomon is, only for us to find out that what's actually going on is Hunter Zolomon was the one pulling the strings that basically sent, like, you know, the Renegades after Iris West, knowing Wally would follow, and with Wally would come Barry. Now, of course, with Hunter Zolomon kind of being incapacitated at the moment and more or less being defeated, the whole conflict switches to Barry versus Wally, and this is where it really picks up. And this is why I say, like Joshua Williamson, I think, is one of the most prolific writers in recent years when it comes to the Flash, because it's a way to take these characters who otherwise may not necessarily have been interesting and turn them into like wildly interesting. As much as I love Francis Manipool's run, at the end of the day, it all just kind of came down to, well, we got to fight Gorilla Grodd and Gorilla City and, you know, Iris, you know, and that kind of a thing. You're like with this, it's Wally legitimately on the hunt for his kids. And it's kind of cool because you can look at this and you can say, like, I understand exactly where Wally's coming from. If I had kids and then they vanished one day, I would go to the ends of the earth. I would set the world on fire if it meant that I would get my kids back. I would sacrifice everyone. I would eliminate everything in my path, do whatever I needed to do in order to get my kids back here. And that's the whole point, is that where Barry's kind of sent directly to Wally by virtue of Commander Cold using the Flash, I guess using the Speed Force signature of Wally to kind of create like a pinpoint, more or less, where Barry can be sent to. When he finally catches up with him, this turns into like, one, somebody did something and screwed up the timeline, so everything starts going nuts. It looks like the actions of Dr. Manhattan, if I'm being honest with you guys. And two, once Barry catches up to Wally directly, the two of them kind of engage in this incredible conversation, because Barry's kind of trying to impart this little bit of wisdom, right? Saying, hey, look, take it from me, the guy who trained you, you can't do this kind of thing. You can't just like run around and do crazy situations and jump into these crazy events, because what you're gonna do if you run back in time, you don't know what you're gonna change. There's no such thing really as like alternate realities. Those don't really exist. I mean, the notion of DC sitting down and saying like, well, there's all these alternate realities that stem out of a single action, it doesn't really work that way anymore. Flashpoint kind of solidified that, and a few things in Rebirth solidified that. What this means is that if Wally goes back and let's say like he goes into the Speed Force, he breaks it, he goes in and like rescues his kids, no one knows what the consequence will be. That's the importance of all this, because that's what Wally's doing. Wally's idea is, I can run into the Speed Force, I'll crack it a little bit, but nothing really terrible is gonna happen. But it's like breaking glass. It's only a matter of time before the whole thing shatters. And that's the whole point, is because the idea seems to be no one knows exactly what will happen. If this Speed Force wall is what holds the multiverse together and all the universes just kind of free float into oblivion, if the destruction of the Speed Force means all the speedsters lose their power, no one knows what the consequences of this will be. But for Wally, it doesn't matter. He doesn't care what the aftermath of this will be. He's a dad who wants to find his kids. And it's kind of funny, because when you have Barry sitting down, like Wally's idea is, look, like you were a mentor once upon a time, but I've been Flash, like I was Flash for a long time. I've carved my niche. I know what I'm about. But if you're getting in my way of finding my kids, you're no friend of mine. So I'm gonna give you a choice. You can move out of the way, or I can run you over. And that's what's so cool. This is kind of like redemption time for Wally West fans, because there's like this amazing standoff. You know, Barry's like, well, if you run, I'll catch you. And Wally's like, you can try. I can give you a head start and you still wouldn't catch me. And that's true. Wally is faster than Barry. And that's what's so awesome about this, is because like you can try your best. You can do anything you want to do. But at the end of the day, if I take off running in that direction, I'll have to stop in order for you to catch me. You're never going to catch up. And so because of that, like it's awesome here, because Wally just like takes off. And it's kind of interesting the way that it's drawn. You almost see it, right? You see like the look of Barry, like, please Wally, don't do it. And Wally's like, this is happening. And Wally just bolts. He's just like gone. And Barry tries to chase after him, and that's where this ends. But it's like, damn, man, like, dude, it's so good. Like, it's so amazing. I love Flash Force so much. It's so badass. Okay, so we're continuing on with the Flash Rebirth, and not really Flash Rebirth, well, I guess the Flash Rebirth, but Flash War. And the whole idea behind this is, remember, for those of you guys who are just now getting into this, Flash War deals with the idea that Wally West discovered that his kids, or at least he was told that his kids were alive. Now again, this information really came from Hunter Zolomon, who of course, as we talked about in previous videos, was a speedster who basically became an enemy of the Flash after he had essentially lost the use of his legs, and wanted the Flash, Wally West, to go back and change time so that everything in Hunter Zolomon's life really hadn't gone awry and gone terrible. But because of the fact that Wally wouldn't do it, Hunter Zolomon became his enemy. And so in this instance, Hunter Zolomon had kind of, seemingly grabbed them from the present day, brought them to the 25th century and said, hey, just so you know, Wally, like your kids are stuck in the Speed Force. If you go out there and you destroy the Speed Force, you'll bring them back. Like you'll basically bring your kids back. And again, it's very much feeding on like the parental instincts of Wally West, which is why it works. The problem with this was that Barry was coming from this from the perspective of like the events of Flashpoint, right? Like when Barry had gone back in time, tried to save his mom's life, he succeeded, but screwed up the universe in the process and had to go back in time and let her die in order to set things back to normal. That's the whole perspective he's coming from here. And trying to impart those pearls of wisdom onto Wally, the whole idea of Wally is, I've grown beyond your protege. I'm not the little kid who was Kid Flash anymore. I'm an adult now with a family that I need to go save. And again, it works, because what parent wouldn't go to the ends of the earth in order to save their kids? The issue with this is when you're talking about two speedsters of such incredible ability, such incredible speed running around, it's not like they move in a vacuum, right? It's not like they move around and nothing's impacted by what they do. They're running at such a high velocity around the earth, with Wally running to break the Speed Force and Barry chasing him down, that they're literally sending ripples throughout the entirety of the universe itself. The very fabric of the universe is literally shaking at the kind of speed and the kind of ripples they're putting off on such a strong level. And so when you have like Amanda Waller, Steve Trevor, and the various members of the government responding to this and trying to find a way to deal with it, their initial response is, well, let's just kind of use weapons, see if we can take them out using tanks or something like that. And of course it doesn't work. And so, this is like a little one-page thing. It's not designed to be a great big huge sprawled out event. But in response to this, you have Amanda Waller who tells Steve Trevor, contact your friends. So of course, this basically means the Justice League. But the important thing about this, and the cool thing with this great big huge moment, is you're talking about two extremely powerful guys in terms of how their speed impacts the world around them. But what this is also going to do is it's really going to kind of reiterate the status quo in relation to how fast like Superman is in relation to these guys, and how fast the various members of the superhero community are in terms of the power they possess. And so where Superman and the rest of the Justice League, and really even some of the Titans, show up on the scene and say, hey, look, like, what's going on here? They're basically given the news by Steve Trevor saying that, like, Wally wants to break the Speed Force, Barry's chasing him down, it's creating ripples throughout the entire fabric of the universe, you guys have to find a way to stop him. And what ends up happening is Superman immediately takes off after them. And that's kind of the funny thing, because when Superman races off, you know, it's basically like, hey, you guys have to stop, you guys have to slow down, but it only lasts for like a fraction of a second. I mean, it is so astronomically quick, and Superman has to back off because he can't keep up. And that's one of the big things that I want you guys to really bring from this. When it comes to like status quos in comic books, they change all the time. And so really it's kind of been one of those things where for the last, I would say probably about the last 20 years, it's been generally accepted that the Flashes are faster than Superman, because of what use would the Flash be if he's not the fastest man alive? He's just a guy that can run really fast. And so because of this, like it really kind of fits into the status quo. Now again, going all the way back to like the 40s, 50s, 60s, and really from the 60s going forward, especially with regards to Barry Allen, really from the mid 50s going forward in the modern day, you're talking about like the Flash versus Superman. Those races are iconic. But really it wasn't until recent years, within the last 10, 20 years or so, that it's kind of been established the Flash is always faster than Superman, because that's just how fast he is. But from there, you switch over to Green Lantern, and Green Lantern's response is, well, if Superman can't stop him, then the big green wall will bring him to an end. And again, they blast right through it. I mean, they literally they tear right through the Green Lantern's wall. And this is a huge moment. This is one of the things that's really, really crazy here, because when you're talking about this much force moving this fast, there's very few things that can stand in the way of it. And this is designed to highlight a couple of different things. While it does kind of show that the Flashes are moving exceedingly fast, the real big takeaway from this is that like Green Lantern can't stop him, Superman can't catch him. If we ran into a situation where the Flash truly decided that he wanted to be a villain and just unleash holy hell across the world, there wouldn't really be a whole lot of people who can stop him. Like there really wouldn't be a whole lot of people that could get in his way. And this is really more, I imagine, of like vindication for Flash fans, right? Like I've been telling people for years, the Flash is one of the strongest characters there is, and nobody ever wanted to believe me. That's really where this kind of fits in here, because you're talking about a person who's so fast and moving at such an incredible speed that really people are just in the way. And that's really all it comes down to. So again, it's a really interesting moment here. But one of the things to bear in mind is it really is Barry trying to impart this wisdom onto Wally. That's really what he's trying to do here. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's been around for a long time, and he was learning how to be the Flash when he first gained his speed, and he was understanding what it meant to be a hero, that there would be times when your moral compass would be questioned, but you always have to do the right thing. You know, Barry had walked that path, he'd walked that road. Wally picked up after Barry. You know, Wally gained his powers as a little kid, and Barry was imparting all that wisdom on him when he was a little kid, when he was Kid Flash. And then when Barry died during Crisis on Infinite Earths, or at least was believed to have died, Wally took up the pieces. You know, he picked up the pieces, took up the mantle, and became the new Flash, and he had to discover all those things on his own. But it's not like there's really a right or a wrong here. It's not like there's, you know, it's really one of those very hairy, morally ambiguous middle grounds. It's very much a gray area, because on one half, the Speed Force being destroyed, who knows what effect it would have on the multiverse. And so like you're talking about this idea that like the Speed Force could literally destroy the entire fabric of creation. And while Barry's trying to stop Wally from doing that, at the same time, Wally's trying to rescue his kids. And it makes perfect sense. You know, Speed Force and universe be damned, Wally wants to find his kids. And it's a perfect thing. It's exactly what any parent would do. And that's why it makes it so cool. And that's one of the reasons why, like looking at this whole situation unfolding, this is why Wally West always had his dedicated fan base. It's the reason why fans always loved Wally. Because what you're talking about here is a character that's so emotional in a lot of ways and is so grounded and so rooted. That was really the big difference between Barry and Wally. I mean, looking back at the earlier days of comics, Barry was very grounded and he was very tangible, you know, but really he was more of like the iconic superhero. He was born and bred in the age of 1950s science fiction meets superhero themes. He was the one that reinvigorated interest in comic books, you know, with DC Showcase #4. And so with that in mind, like Wally was a lot more grounded. He was a lot more tangible, because by the time he became the new Flash in the mid to late 1980s, it was really a wholly different era of comics. Gwen Stacy had died, Dark Knight Returns was about to kick off. You had like all these things that had been going on that it made heroes a lot darker and a lot more gritty and a lot more real world and realistic. And so those themes were rolled over into the Wally West comics. That combined with the fact that everybody loved him from Justice League Unlimited and all that kind of stuff. It basically meant that you had a recipe for like everyone's favorite Flash. And so that's why people love Wally so much. But from there, you essentially have Wally who succeeds, like literally seems to break through the Speed Force and shatter the Speed Force in its entirety. The problem with this is that's not what happens. The Speed Force is not broken and it's not destroyed. The Speed Force is still very much there. Instead, what ends up happening here is Hunter Zolomon essentially appears appears, but after taking out all the members of the Justice League. And the reason why is because the sky is kind of shattered. It's basically broken. And where the belief is that the Speed Force is broken, what Hunter Zolomon says is that's not what's going on here. What's actually going on here is I basically lied to you. And it was the most predictable outcome. There was really no point where Joshua Williamson believed that we would believe that Hunter Zolomon had become a good guy. He's just like that incorrigible, unchangeable villain. And so it was a matter of just kind of seeing how this situation would play out. And Hunter Zolomon's response is, you guys believe there's only the Speed Force, but that's not true. There's the Strength Force, there's the Sage Force, there's all these different forces out there. Now, this actually makes a whole lot of sense when you really break it down. And the reason why I say this is the Speed Force is the most prominent force, just because of the fact that you're talking about like how speedsters draw their power. But with regards to this whole concept, if speedsters draw their super speed from the Speed Force, then where do like super strong characters draw their energy from? Where do like psychics draw their energy from? That's why this works so well. It's shuffling up the status quo, it's changing things up a bit. What Joshua Williamson is doing here is the Flash equivalent to Jeff Johns expanding on the Green Lantern Corps and saying now there's a Red Lantern Corps and a Sinestro Corps and Black Lanterns and White Lanterns and Indigos and Blue Lanterns and Star Sapphires and all these kind of things. You know, that's why it works, is because it's expanding on this mythos that could really even go beyond the Flash mythos itself. But at the moment, what Hunter Zolomon had been doing was studying the entire, really the history of like the world, you know, of what had been going on over the course of like decades and decades and decades running up to the 25th century. And what this means is that Hunter Zolomon is aware of Dr. Manhattan. He's aware of like the war that will take place, at least it seems like he is. And so his whole argument is we need like an actual hero, a true hero. You guys are not heroes. You guys are standing in for heroes. You're parading around, you're not really solving anything. You're just running around in circles hoping things change. But he's like, I've basically, like the whole point behind this was to have you guys smash through this quote unquote force barrier. So the Speed Force is still there. But what you've done is you've now released the Sage Force and you've released the Strength Force. And what it means is that Hunter Zolomon can now tap into these things. And what that means now is Hunter Zolomon has telepathy and telekinesis. Hunter Zolomon has super strength and Hunter Zolomon has super speed. He's literally, just like Superman, amplified several times over with the powers of Martian Manhunter. This guy is a walking, talking god on Earth. Okay, so we are picking up with the conclusion to Flash War, and it's actually pretty cool, and it's sort of interesting. There's actually a huge consequence, well, really two big consequences that come out of this whole thing. One of which you may or may not care about. The other of which most of you will be pretty excited about. So it's a pretty cool thing here. It's pretty awesome. I remember a little bit of catch up here. Basically, the Wally West villain, Hunter Zolomon, is looking to travel into the past and essentially prevent the loss of his legs, you know, basically make his life what he wanted it to be. The problem with this and what the way it kind of works is it's one of those things where like absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what this means is that along the way of trying to gain, you know, trying to travel into the past and fix his life more or less, Hunter Zolomon had discovered that there was the Speed Force, which is where speedsters derive their power from, but there was also the Sage Force and the Strength Force. The Sage Force basically being more of like a psychic force, and then the Strength Force being where people draw their strength from. Now, what Joshua Williamson hasn't really done here is tie this into the greater DC universe, and he may not. And what I mean by that is, if the Speed Force is where speedsters draw their power from, then is the Strength Force where like Superman and like Solomon Grundy and like, you know, super strong characters, is that where they draw their strength from? And like all the psychics and people like that, do they draw their power from the Sage Force? Is that how that works? That may or may not be tied in. DC usually keeps things confined to character-driven arcs, so like a Batman story arc, Superman story arc, Flash story arc, but we don't know if in this instance, these forces will spill over into the rest of the DC universe and say, well, you know, this also affects Superman and so on and so forth. There's no reason to believe they don't, because the Speed Force permeates the entirety of reality, but only the speedsters can tap into the Speed Force and use Speed Force powers. And so because of that, it's kind of interesting. It's really a fun little caveat. And so for the most part, it was basically it was Wally and Barry trying to track down or trying to stop Hunter Zolomon and keep him from going crazy. The problem is that with all these new powers, there's really not much that they can do to stop him. Now, the other thing here is that because of what he's doing, because of the fact that he basically ran to the past and started changing things up, what this meant is that he was essentially eradicating the 25th century where he comes from. And that's the reason why you have like Commander Cold, who's from the 25th century, Iris West, and you know, New 52 Wally West, who are just kind of stranded in this void, more or less, this what would be the 25th century, but isn't there anymore. Now, the way in which Hunter Zolomon was able to do this was by manipulating something called hypertime. Now, hypertime is a weird idea. A very weird idea in the realm of DC Comics. The best way I know how to say it. So take DC's publishing comic book era, like when they were publishing comic books, between like 1938 when Superman first showed up and like 1984. Basically what you had is you had like different Earths, quote unquote. They were given like numerical designations. So you had Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, Earth 4, and the numerical designation was designed to do nothing more than to basically say, this is a different universe. That's all it was for. What DC did is they said, these universes have always existed. Earth 2 is the age of World War II superheroes, you know, the golden age of superheroes, basically. And then Earth S was where Shazam, that's where the whole Shazam family was. And Earth 1 is all the superhero stories that involve, you know, Barry Allen and that Justice League team and so on and so forth. All that ran until about 1984 when it became too convoluted and complicated to understand for new fans anyway, and so DC cut it all loose. They dropped it, they canceled all that stuff with Crisis on Infinite Earths, and after that they said now there's only one universe, and that ran for about 14 years. And the reason why is because in 1999 Grant Morrison and Mark Waid had this idea of saying, yeah, but like we want the multiverse back, but we can't really have it back. And so what they did is they created Hypertime, and Hypertime was DC's attempt to copy Marvel's multiverse. In Marvel Comics you only ever had one universe, but then like a thing would happen where you would create like a divergent universe based on that. So like in the main Marvel universe, Peter Parker gains the Venom suit, right? The Venom symbiote suit. And then in the main Marvel universe, he travels back to Earth and he meets with Reed Richards, and Reed Richards says, actually, that suit that you're wearing is alive. It's a living, breathing organism. You should get rid of it. And so Peter goes to a bell tower. He starts ringing the bells. The suit hates the sound, all the pain and everything, and leaves, and then eventually bonds to Eddie Brock. Thus, Venom is born. An alternate reality would be, what if Spider-Man never stopped being Venom? Then like that would be an alternate reality story. But that alternate universe exists because it branches off of the main Marvel universe. DC tried to copy that, and what they said is, in addition to branching off, sometimes it'll loop back and intersect with the main DC universe. The problem was that it was actually more complicated than the multiverse they had before, and it seemed really, really unnecessary, and so fans didn't really like it too much. Now, all that turned out to be a moot purpose because in 2006 they brought the multiverse back with Infinite Crisis, but it was an attempt to kind of have the multiverse without actually having the multiverse. And so that's kind of what Joshua Williamson is doing here, that Hypertime exists, but this is only a temporary thing, because as they're running through and as they're literally like racing through, and we're seeing like these different realities, these different universes, you know, or really these different points in time where you have like the Flashpoint fight between Barry Allen and Eobard Thawne. You've got Barry dying during Crisis on Infinite Earths. You have like all these different eras in history of DC. You also have like Jai and Iris. It's like them as adults in the future. And so it's kind of cool to see this thing unfold, because as they're racing through, they're actually seeing their life the way it could have been, because Hunter Zolomon is changing things as he's racing through time. Like the very act of doing it is essentially changing things here and there. Not massive things, but things that are small enough that they can have effects later on. They can basically create ripple effects all throughout the time stream. They can have like big ramifications. And so it's kind of cool here, because like when they're going through, Hunter Zolomon's whole stance is like, but I don't understand why you're trying to stop me though, because Barry did it. So why is it okay for Barry, but it's not okay for me? You know, and it's interesting because Wally had the exact same stance. You know, when Wally was like, I want to go back in time and I want to stop all this from happening so I can have Giant Iris. You know, I want to prevent Manhattan or whoever it was from messing with the time stream. So, you know, nobody forgets these last 10 years and I've got my kids and so on and so forth. And Barry's like, no, you can't do that. And the way that Barry comes off here, that's kind of the funny thing. The way that Barry comes off here, both to Wally and even Hunter Zolomon, is don't do as I do as I say do. If you go through and start changing time, you're going to screw things up in really bad ways that you can't even really imagine. And when you go back to change it, you can never go back to the things the way they were supposed to be, or at least that's the opinion Barry has. Of course, we know they were because of what Manhattan did. Things didn't, but still, the fact remains here that it's interesting because Hunter Zolomon, I mean, initially was not going back in time. Now he's kind of gone mad with power. So he's like, I'll create the universe to my liking and everything will be the way I want it to be. And it's a little disappointing. I mean, Joshua Williamson is an incredible writer, but it's a little disappointing because Hunter Zolomon kind of falls into the cliche villain role. Like, I have this amazing scheme and this amazing desire, and you know, it's so human because all I want to do is just change my past and keep crappy things from happening to me. But now I've got all this power, I'm gonna remake reality in my image. And it's just kind of like, okay, I understand, but like, I kind of like, it seems a little cliche. But even then, like, it's still a cool idea. That's one of the reasons why Joshua Williamson's Flash writing is so awesome, because by and large, the characters are so human and so solid in terms of how they're being written and how they're being, how they're being given to us. And so the fight here is actually pretty awesome. It's basically a speedster fight, but as they're going through and as they're literally facing off against each other, what ends up happening is that it's kind of hard to explain. When you have Wally fighting against Hunter Zolomon, he almost creates like these Speed Force constructs. Now, when I say create Speed Force constructs, I don't mean like creating like Speed Force Lightning or something like that. What I mean is actually creating what are essentially Flash equivalent of like Green Lantern hard light constructs. And these come in the form of like Jay Garrick and Jai and Iris and like Max Mercury. And it's just like these speedsters we haven't seen in forever, because it's kind of like, you know, my family runs with me, that kind of a thing. And so that's why these moments are awesome. That's why these things are so important, is because this is like a one little moment thing. And like when the story ends, it could be like in the next issue, Barry's kind of like, so let's talk about those constructs you made, Wally. And it's like, yeah, man, I have no idea what that was or how that works, but like we should try it again. And suddenly he's like sending people after, sending Speed Force constructs after people. But more so than that, it's kind of Joshua Williamson's tribute to like the speed to the Flash mythos. Because if you're somebody who picked up with the Flash in DC Rebirth and never read anything before, then Flash fans will tell you you're really missing out. Because people who sit down and who have been reading the Flash for years and years and years and years, running all the way back to like Jeff Johns' Flash Rebirth, the original Flash Rebirth, and even before that, they look at people like Max Mercury, they look at Impulse, Bart Allen, they look at Jay Garrick, these different members of the Flash family, and it's like, but it's not a complete family yet, because all you have really right now is Wally and Barry and New 52 Wally, and that's really about it. This cohesive family unit of Flashes doesn't really exist, or at least it's not there right now. And so it kind of leaves people wanting to see that return. And so for people, who are looking at this as kind of a small glimpse of how things could be, where all these different speedsters are going to start making their return. And so it's kind of it's a really good sort of feel-good moment. It kind of hits people right in the feels, with regards to how they feel about the Flash mythos and the speedsters they want to see return and all that kind of good stuff. And so essentially what ends up happening is you basically have, in the aftermath of all this, because of what's happened with Hunter Zolomon, the Speed Force has in fact been broken. And the result here is that while speedsters can still tap into the Speed Force, what it means is that with it being fractured, there's no means to travel back and forth through time. Basically, hypertime's gone. It's destroyed. Time travel is destroyed. Like speedsters cannot run back and forth through time. Now, this is with regards to speedsters. And that's why like the Sage and Strength Force are two distinctly different things, because when it comes to speedsters traveling, like running back and forth through time, originally that all started with Barry Allen's ability to like vibrate through dimensional walls, right? Like to vibrate through these sort of universal barriers that separated one universe from another. Now that went away after Crisis on Infinite Earths. And because that went away, the question was, well, what's Wally's ability going to be? What's going to make him unique in comparison to everybody else? We'll just let him be so fast he can run back and forth through time. Like just have that be the case for Wally, for Wally West, that was his thing. Like he was able to mainline the Speed Force, and by doing so, run back and forth through time. Barry had to use a cosmic treadmill to do that, even before he died. When you're talking about this, it basically means that like the ability to move back and forth from one point in time to another to change history doesn't exist anymore for the speedsters. Now, initially it kind of seems like, okay, well that's cool, I guess, but that's a pretty big moment actually. It's a pretty significant thing, because what it means is no more flashpoints. What's going to happen, at least as far as Joshua Williamson's writing goes, is from the time from this point until the time he stops writing, then there will never be an instance of time travel. It'll never be an instance where they will run back into the past and quote unquote fix things. And that's actually a genius idea, because a problem with time travel, because Bendis was really guilty of this back in the day, but the problem with time travel is it's basically used by writers to write themselves out of a hole. It's like, well, I mean, I have this really cool story, and like, it was awesome up until the end, but I don't know how to fix it. So time travel, and they just jump back into the past. But with hypertime, with the inability of Flash is being able to travel back and forth through time, what it means is that Joshua Williams is basically telling us, as long as I'm writing the Flash, consequences are consequences. When something happens, that thing is happening. Now, after Joshua Williamson leaves, then it could very well be that, well, somebody will use time travel and fix things and so on and so forth. That's the nature of writers. Writers just kind of bend stories to their own whim and write whatever stories they want, so long as, editorial's okay with it and fans don't give them too much hate. But still, that's really kind of the big thing here. But the big moment, the big takeaway from all of this is that as a direct result of the actions of essentially breaking the Speed Force, a speedster has returned. Another speedster has popped up. And this speedster is Bart Allen, also known as Impulse, not Bart Hoare, not the crazy religious guy from the future, but the original Bart Allen. And this is a huge moment. Now, if you want to know more about Bart Allen, check out my video down in the description. I have a video on Bart Allen Explained where we run over his whole character. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, let me know what you guys think about this story. And I will catch you all later. Peace.